What's going on, guys? It's Daniel DeBrocke here, host of the Stack Strength podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we've got a special guest, Charly Joung, and we are going to be talking all about bodybuilding and powerlifting and clothing apparel and all sorts of new stuff. So, first off, thanks so much for jumping on, man. We had a little bit of an internet snafu last time, and so I appreciate you taking the time to reschedule and jump back on.
Oh,
Can
no
you
worries,
tell?
man.
Can you just introduce yourself and give a little bit of background for people who maybe aren't familiar with who you are and some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, my name is Charlie Joung. I've been, I guess, lifting and doing the whole diet thing for about 21, 22 years now. Started off kind of just, as a gym rat, then went on to powerlifting. Did that for a while. The best total was 1925 at 242. And then about 4 years or so ago, I left powerlifting behind and wanted to give a shot at bodybuilding. I've done two shows so far. My first one won the overall, won the super heavy weight class, and then I went on to do the 2021 NBC Nationals and got first callouts. So just kind of working at my next one now, and not sure exactly when that's going to be, but excited to kind of bring a better package to stage next time.
That's awesome, man. And so one of the things actually that I found hilarious was I didn't know that you were a powerlifter until, I mean, I found out a while back, but how I found out was fucking hilarious because you were doing Smith machine squats. This is I think an Instagram video or something like that. You were doing Smith machine squats and some guy called you out and they were like, oh, Smith machine squats are for bitches or some sort of throwaway comment like that. Try
Yeah.
squatting like a real man or something like that. And then I remember your response was hilarious. You were like, oh, how about my 800-pound competition squat or something like that? And I was just like, one, I was like, oh shit, I didn't know that you were a powerlifter at the time. And then two, it was just like the best troll.
Right.
It was just hilarious, man. Yeah. So I thought that was so funny because it's just like, just talk about missing the point,
Right.
of what someone's trying to do, It's like, yeah, it was hilarious. But so what made you decide to transition from powerlifting into bodybuilding?
I think it's pretty common. It's the whole I was broken for the most part, to keep it simple,
Yeah.
but I kept running into the same reoccurring like nags, tendonitis in both arms from the low bar squatting, carried over the bench. I couldn't bench, and that kept happening every time I did a meet prep. Um, and from there, I mean, for me, it wasn't fun anymore training because I know I couldn't tap into my true potential. So I kind of did one final meet, did okay, but that tendonitis was really holding me back on bench after squatting. So, I kind of decided to give hypertrophy work a fair shot, with the idea that I'd come back to powerlifting. But as soon as I started training in that style, I fell more and more in love with it. I layered the diet on top of that and kind of like statistically fell in love with that too. So I kind of just decided, I'm like, oh, I'm done with powerlifting now, and I want to give, you know, bodybuilding kind of all my attention at this point. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that actually because I had a bit of a health issue maybe about a year ago now where I just started fainting randomly, and
Whoa.
so I had to drop out of a competition because I was like, I just go for a walk and I just like full on pass out. And actually, my so the gym that I train at right now, we're all like a very close knit community, and I was just standing there like next to a couple of my friends, and then I just like full on fell, and then the owner of the gym always is watching the cameras to see what's going on. And so he literally clipped that and then sent it to a bunch of people, and they're like, "Hey, keep an eye on Daniel. I don't want him fucking getting hurt or something like that." And so, and so, like, I haven't seen the film yet, or no, someone did show me the film, and it's hilarious. I'm just standing there, and all of a sudden, I'm like, "Whoa," and then I just like full on collapse. It was kind of funny, but that essentially kind of pushed me into bodybuilding. Not bodybuilding like competitively or anything, but I kind of had to switch my focus temporarily. So I had to kind of pull away from powerlifting, do a lot more machines, externally stabilized stuff, just because if I pass out while I'm squatting, that's probably not the greatest.
Scientific.
And I've been really shocked at how beneficial bodybuilding would be in powerlifting from an injury risk
Yes.
standpoint, from like a recovery standpoint, like mostly just from like injuries. Like I really think that people could benefit a lot. And so, especially being on your side of things, where it's like you are, you know, a national level bodybuilder. I don't want to mess up titles or anything like that, but
I
then
think
also
so.
you have,
Yeah.
yeah, and then you're also an elite powerlifter. Like, what are some of the things that you think both sides could benefit from in terms of actually adopting some of the strategies or tactics that from the other side, anyways?
Yeah. So kind of starting off to your points exactly, right? I think a lot of powerlifters would benefit from more hypertrophy style um, training in their kind of off season. I think a lot of powerlifters kind of fall into the trap of them thinking they're going to get weaker by doing hypertrophy style work. Yeah, their kind of immediate strength profile will drop off because they're not doing those, movements, squat, bench, deadlift, maybe, and they're doing more machines. But I think the carryover when you do flow into a strength block and peak is going to be far beneficial for them. One, less overuse injuries because they're not constantly using the same movement patterns. Two, they just grow more muscle this way, right? Because one, less injury risk. So less injured you are, the more time you have in the gym to actually build muscle. The more muscle you have, I think the higher strength ceiling that you have, the potential to be stronger. So, yeah, I think if powerlifters, unfortunately, I see a lot of them fall into that trap. Their hypertrophy work is just doing higher reps and more sets of the exact same movements. I think if they got, used more machines, more variations, they'd be a lot better, a lot stronger, a lot healthier in the long run. On the flip side, this is kind of what I see from guys that are just starting off that might want to do bodybuilding, hypertrophy style training. Is that not all of them, but there is definitely a portion where I see their training because I've coached a lot of these guys too, where I'll look at their log books and I'll write out like, 3 sets, rep range 10 to 15, and I'll see 15, 15, 15. And then next exercise, 20, 20, 20. And I'm like, so like, one-offs here and there, fine, especially first week or two when they're kind of acclimating to the program. But when I see a continuous trend like that, big thing pops out. They don't know how to train intense enough. They don't know how to push themselves. And I think that's one big thing that I found coming from powerlifting to bodybuilding that was huge. Knowing already how to push myself to the limit, right? That being said, when I transitioned over, I kind of scaled back because, as a powerlifter, you will push it to till the wheels fall off, right? So there is some scaling back in terms of if you started powerlifting and then at a high level, especially then went to bodybuilding, you'll want to back off when technique starts breaking down and not when you actually start breaking down, right? But I think that's a big thing that carries over, especially for, that group of folks that just don't know how to push themselves enough.
I think some of those practical things that you mentioned, I'd like to dive into that a lot more because, for instance, when you were talking about volume work, like I think a fair amount of powerlifters now do volume work, but exactly like you said, instead of doing volume work on things that are going to be less fatiguing and kind of intentionally vary up the stimulus, they just end up doing 6 sets of 10 high bar squats. And they're like,
Hmm.
oh, it's 'cause I'm giving my elbows a break. And it's like, I'm not going to sit here and say that that's wrong because plenty of people have gotten really strong, doing that. But there's definitely more considerations in terms of, okay, well, what would happen if you maintained a good strength stimulus in your primary movements, but then did a lot of volume on, like, let's say the belt squat and
Hmm.
weren't chasing weight, but we're chasing like actually connecting with the muscle. And so it's like muscular fatigue, like true muscular fatigue. And it's like, have you ever seen a powerlifter do lat pull downs or dumbbell rows? It's like, boom, they're
Yeah.
just moving weight, And it's like,
Yeah.
how connected are you to that muscle? And so those were a lot of things that I learned that stupid as it sounds, I was just like, I would tell other people to do that, but I wasn't necessarily as good at that until I did like a good almost a year long stint in bodybuilding style training. So I think there's a lot of practical things like that. So from an execution standpoint, what are some of those things that you might look to suggest to, let's say, powerlifters implementing more bodybuilding? And then also, I know you talked about intensity and understanding how to increase your output, but doing it intelligently so you're not just fucking yourself up. And then some of the things, considerations for bodybuilders looking at how to kind of match the same intensity that maybe a powerlifter might do and things like that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for powerlifters going into kind of bodybuilding style of training, I think a really important thing here is that when you train more for hypertrophy versus kind of just all out strength outputs, um, you want the muscle doing the work, right? And like you said, if you're using momentum in your movements, you're just practicing that movement to be stronger at that movement, and that's not what we're doing here, right? That's because that's what powerlifting is in essence, right? You're practicing to be stronger at that movement, while hypertrophy style training, you're just trying to actually make that movement as hard as possible and have the muscles take all the fatigue and the load. So I think bearing that in mind and knowing that's going to give you the best results in the long run, for me at least, that helped a ton. Because initially, when I kind of started off going from powerlifting to bodybuilding, I did the exact same thing. Right, I use a lot of momentum in my movements. Although I was new to machines, and kind of stepping away from the squat, bench, deadlift. I was still using that powerlifting mentality of training style. But as soon as I realized and kind of looked at the long journey, that I will be better off and stronger in the long run and healthier by not letting myself be victim to the ego. That helped a ton. And on the other end of things, I guess some guys, not all of them, some guys that do start in bodybuilding and don't have the intensity. One simple trick here is I literally have my clients film themselves on their last kind of week of their first block, where we kind of get to know each other and see how their intensity is. And I just say go to failure. Let's see what that looks like, right? Because I can tell when someone gives up just because it gets hard versus they they're giving up because their muscles just won't move it the weight anymore. So I think that test, and even if you're recording for yourself and looking at it and being honest and evaluating yourself honestly, I think that's kind of could be a big help in kind of helping you know to push further next time.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of using rep ranges for that reason because it's like, well, I have to get 20, so I don't want to go up because what if I miss it? And it's like, no, no, but now you can do 15 to 20, or now you can do 4 to 6, or now you can do 8 to 10. And so it's like if you miss a rep or two, it's not the end of the world because you're still within your range.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've always seen that as well where there's this sort of reluctance to go up because you're like, man, this is really hard. And it's like, well, yeah, but I kind of find it funny because it's like the whole point is for it to be difficult.
Yeah.
Like that's literally the objective. If it weren't difficult, then you wouldn't be doing the job. But coming back to what you were talking about previously about differentiating what the outcomes are when you're training, and you might have different objectives within the same training session. So, for instance, when people are always debating about should you train to failure, should you not train to failure, it's like, well, I don't know anyone who exclusively trains to failure, and I don't know anyone who exclusively trains to 1 to 3 reps in reserve. Like mine certainly aren't like that. Mine are very blended, where it's like my top sets are, usually maybe 2 reps in reserve or something like that. But then some of my accessory work is like to failure, like actual failure. But then sometimes it's not quite to failure until the last set. Like it's real hard. It's like a true 1 to 2 RIR, but then that last set I'm pushing to absolute failure. So it's like it's really difficult to quantify those things. But at the same time, I know that it's really important to be able to understand like what you're trying to accomplish with each exercise within each session. And so when you're working with a client, or just for people who are listening, who are training themselves, how do you communicate intensity and sorry, not intensity. How do you communicate the objective of an exercise, or like, here's the intent of this exercise? Because again, throughout the entire duration of a workout, you might have 4 different focuses depending on the exercise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. You're saying in a program if there are different kind of objectives at that point. So, for example, if someone is powerlifting and they want to do more hypertrophy style training, but they still want to keep a core movement in there or a variation of a core movement, right?
Yeah, sure. I guess it's like, yeah, it would probably be a little bit more directed at powerlifters then, yeah, because it's like, you know, there needs to be a separation between like performance for squat, bench, deadlift versus versus like just hypertrophy training. So yeah.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of this depends on how the program's set up, but like I said, if you're a powerlifter and trying to do more hypertrophy style training and still want to keep a variation of the core movement in there, for example, the way you train, it sounds like you'll do maybe a high bar squat, couple sets, and then that's not volume work, right? It's just two sets, maybe at maybe 8 to 12 reps. Keep one or two in the tank, and then from there, since it's not super fatiguing, two sets at 1 to 2 RIR, especially if you're going to carry that throughout the block, just to kind of maintain some technique of the original lift, and also kind of maintain some of that strength profile. Your other movements, depending on if they're isolation or more compound, you can get closer to failure, especially for smaller movements and more isolation movements, going to failure. For my side delts, I can pretty much do it all the time and recover in time and still make progress, right? So I think a lot of it is depending on what the needs are of the client or the lifter in this case. But yeah.
No, for sure. I guess one of the things that I'm trying to get at, maybe I'm probably not doing a very good job of communicating it, but like understanding how within a session the objective can change, like for an exercise, So it's like if you're doing squats, for instance, your focus is on technique, execution, loading. If you're doing, let's say Bulgarian split squat, you're not necessarily trying to move as much load as you can. You're trying to execute in a very specific way to load your hips, your glutes, a combination of the two, whatever. If it's contralateral, there's like some, other anti-rotation flexion stuff there. But like I've always found that communicating with clients what the objective is. So like a lot of the times I'll try and do it in my video reviews where I'll be like, hey, I really like how you're executing this. What I want you to think is the objective right now is to do this. It's not to move the most amount of weight. It's not to move really fast. I want you slowing things down and doing so it's like communicating like, here's what I want you to focus on for this exercise. And then maybe for the next exercise, that focus is going to change a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so intent of the actual movement and maybe not sometimes RIR, kind of plays into that, the intensity that you're going to use for
Yeah.
the movement. But yeah, for me, I kind of plan that in the forefront, right, of a program for a client. I'll write the tempo down. I'll write the prescription of that exact exercise so that we know why we're doing it. But the tempo alone, if you write that down, it's hard to fuck that up, right?
Yeah.
Because, if you put down like 3-1-0-1 for a hack squats, we know that it's not to move the most amount of weight. Because if you're using a true 3-second negative on a hack squat, you're just going to be limited by your technique, which is a good thing at this point. Because then your muscles are taking the brunt of that load versus you using momentum to get out of the hole. So I think for people that might have trouble with that, kind of self-prescribing tempos ahead of time is a huge win.
No, that's a good point. And so when it comes to actually addressing orthopedic health, like because you did go through injuries yourself, because you have experienced that and you coach athletes, what's your thought process around addressing like injuries and just longevity, I guess, in your training? How do you structure your training or maybe like various lifestyle interventions or things like that that you might incorporate?
Um, I mean, uh, strangely enough, the one big thing I got from powerlifting that helped me a ton, probably also losing a bunch of body fat, is just being more active in my daily life. Not sitting around all the time, getting 10K steps a day at least. That's helped a ton. But beyond that, exercise variation. I usually won't let personally heavy compound movements stay in my program for more than 3 mesocycles in a row, even if it does feel good. I'll still swap them out. I think the more advanced of lifter you are, the more variation you need, and the more you have to swap out exercises versus maybe a beginner intermediate, you could kind of keep in the same exercise for a while, right? And I think that's, like I said, being smart about that and kind of thinking forward is going to help a ton in just preventing these issues. And when I do run into kind of, you know, injuries or little nags, so right now it's kind of gone away now, thank God. But about 6 months ago, I was dealing with a groin injury. And what I did was stay away from anything that bothered it. It's not to the point where it like kind of bothered it. If it bothered it, I just stayed away completely and then made sure to train around it for a block or two and then slowly start introducing movements that are similar to what bothered it. Maybe with a reverse band on a hack squat or leg press. That helped a ton because it reduced load at the bottom where I felt it in my groin. And yeah, slowly just adding load, removing the band, um, and about 6 months later, I was kind of good to go. And still now, to this day, I will make sure to warm up properly, especially my groin, maybe 10 to 15 minutes prior to my um, session to kind of make sure that I'm ready.
Hmm. Yeah, I think warm-ups are definitely one of those things that are pretty underrated by by a lot of lifters. They'll go in there, they'll jump on the treadmill, or they'll just kind of do some like band pull-aparts, but it's very like unintentional a lot of the
Yeah.
times. Yeah. So it's funny that you say that because I think a lot of people as well are sort of nervous about removing exercises, especially if they're going really well.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about maintaining an extra, like, were you talking about a specific exercise, like pulling that out? So let's say you're doing SSB squats or something like that, or a hack squat, and you're doing that, you won't do that for longer than three mesos, or do you just mean in general you won't have like heavy phases in there for longer than three?
Oh no, I'll completely remove the exercise altogether
Okay.
because I
Okay.
don't
Yeah.
want to continue using that same movement pattern for too long because I just know I've done that in the past. I'll run into the same knee, like little soreness in the knee, like right above my
Hmm.
kneecap, like right where my quad tendon is, right?
Yeah.
And that has nothing to do with, well, I wouldn't say nothing, but it has less to do with the actual movement being unfriendly to me, and more so me as an advanced lifter using that much load and that many repetitions and kind of constantly using the same patterns of movement. That's what's kind of, causing those overuse injuries. So I make sure not to let it go beyond that, even if it feels great. I mean, even if I'm making progress on it, I can still switch to something else, get novel stimulus, and make progress there. And then, if a hack squat I moved away from, it'll always be there, and I could go back to it, 2 blocks, 3 blocks later, and make continued progress there too.
It's funny because that takes actually a lot of experience to be able to determine because on the one hand, kind of a good heuristic is if something's working, don't fuck with it. You
Yeah,
know, like you're making good progress, you've got good momentum, but then at the same time, once you do reach a certain level of experience like yourself, where you kind of know intuitively, like, hey, everything's going really well, but I think it's
but
about time to kind of pull back. And it's like you kind of want to hit it before you reach that threshold where your body tells you you need to change. And that's difficult, but that takes a lot of like attention to detail, a good, accurate logbook, and then just actually paying attention and being very intentional about your training and progression strategies and things like that. So, in terms of diet and training topics, I'm always interested to hear about how people's perspectives have kind of evolved because I often find myself changing my mind on, I don't know, things here and there, especially the more experience I get with things outside of just strength sports, like different field sport, I guess exposure and things like that in the bodybuilding. So I'm always curious to hear, I'm curious to hear like what sort of training and or dietary or lifestyle topics that you sort of had a change of heart on and why that might be the case.
oh man, so I've probably tried not every because I know there's some wild diets out there, but I've tried most diets, at least the mainstream ones, over the past 2 decades. I've tried keto. I've tried I guess let me get back to it. One of the first diets I ran when I started getting serious was pretty much like chicken breasts, broccoli, rice, sweet potato, olive oil. And pretty much that's it. That's all I ate, right? And strangely enough, that was not strange. It made sense. I made some of my best gains, though I was a beginner also, right? And then when I got into powerlifting, I ate like that in the forefront. And then as I got more into the culture of powerlifting, that shifted away from kind of those food choices to me hitting my protein targets and my other macros to me just hitting my protein targets and then whatever blend of macros gets me to my calorie goal. And that ended up slowly going to like really, really high fats, fast food, kind of just things that probably aren't great to eat all the time. The powerlifting diet, like donuts before a workout, it's great.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then actually I had like a very serious, life-threatening stomach medical issue because of that. And I went back to eating kind of like a bodybuilder. That kind of like overlaid with my whole transition from powerlifting to bodybuilding, and just saw like a really, really um, good improvement in health and performance. Um, but yeah, that's kind of like one I went back and forth on for a while. I think a lot of the kind of I was sticking to my guns as a powerlifter at the whole, macros don't matter too much as long as I hit my protein and my calorie goal. But yeah, that was just obviously me wanting to eat like a shitlord. Um, yeah,
It's so funny because a lot of the research and a lot of like researchers kind of make similar claims where they're like, we just don't find a lot of evidence to show that the macronutrient distribution and blah 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 really matters all that much. It's like so long as calories and protein, and I'm sure you've heard that as well. I think that's complete nonsense. Like the number of times I've worked with athletes, cleaned up their diet, and their performance just shoots through the roof. It's
hmm
like it just seems like a no-brainer. It's like, what are you guys talking about? Like, I just don't understand how someone who's like really well versed and really experienced can make a claim like that. It's just like, because even
I
just from the
think
standpoint of
yeah.
gut health, right? Like, I'm not sure. You said you had a life-threatening issue that was related to that, so I would love to hear more about that if you're open to talking about it. But I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah. I'm more than happy to tell that story.
but like gut health is something that it's like if you're especially let's say you're a super heavyweight lifter and you're gonna do a big squat or deadlift and you've got a bunch of GI distress all the time, you think that's not going to affect your squat and deadlift? Like fuck off. Or your ability to eat and just like sleep potentially. It's like it's going to affect a lot of other things that aren't necessarily just to do with caloric load and protein. So I don't know. I think it's a little bit crazy,
You
but
nailed it on the head, man. I think a lot of it too, like just kind of like you say that you see a lot of like, people kind of preaching that to their athletes they train. I think a lot of it's like conflating the whole, for the normal person, it's probably not that important as long as their diet's pretty balanced. They don't really care about nutrients too much, the macronutrients too much. They get enough protein, it's fine. But yeah, I think maybe that shifted over to their athletes or clients they train because, it's easy. It's an easy way to coach someone, right?
yeah.
Right? Here's your calories and go fuck off and eat what you want. Unfortunately, that's the case sometimes. But yeah, I think you nailed it on the head on that point.
So what exactly happened that you had like such a crazy health issue?
So I was, I mean, this is kind of going to echo your point, right? I was eating like my set calories and kind of however fashion I found most tasty as long as I was getting my protein. And it was affecting my kind of gut health, like my digestion, 100%. I'd go into workouts, I'd be nauseous after one set and like gag, dry heaving, like right after a set because like the lactic acid, but also because like my fucking stomach was just fucked up from eating all that shit
Yeah.
all the time. I every time I ate food, it affected my digestion. So I was always full. So when I ate food to get calories down, I every meal would be force feeding. I'd be gagging between like bites. It was like awful for months and months and months, like probably for more than half a year, maybe almost a full year, to a point where like I woke up one night and I was feeling really sick. I didn't sleep all night, and I got up at 4 in the morning or something like that. I went to the bathroom. I felt nauseous, and I just like puked in the sink, and it was just blood. And I puked more in the toilet, and blood. Not like streaks of blood in your vomit, like blood. Like I just poured out, and I thought to myself, that's strange. This probably shouldn't happen. And and for a split second, I was like, I should probably call off work. I should probably go to ER right now. So I drove myself to the ER and I got out of the car. I vomited blood again, and I got into the ER, and they rushed me to the back and kind of put a giant tube down my nose, down to my stomach. So that's like that's the most uncomfortable, most painful thing I've ever gone through. Um, and
I had
yeah,
something similar to that, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, they said they're like, yeah, we usually sedate people for this, but you are in a rush, so they need to put it right in. So yeah, I started vomiting like blood everywhere over nurses. I got pans as soon as I went in, right? Because they started squeezing saline down my stomach. And yeah, they confirmed like something was ruptured, and I pretty much went straight to the OR. And I woke up in the ICU, and they're like, "Yeah, so you're alive. This is good. You had a tear down your esophagus from the retching and gagging and the acid and always being full." And yeah, they're like, "You're lucky you came in when you did, because if you waited, if you would have went to work that day, you would have not been alive." Um, I woke up and my blood count was like 7.6 or something like that, and you know, I do my blood test regularly, and so I lost like little over half my blood volume, and it was hell. But yeah,
That's wild. That's nuts, man. Well, I mean, I'm glad you're in a better space, but I've that's a pretty damn severe response to really junky eating, and luckily most people don't ever
yeah,
get there, but they do get some
no.
pretty bad GI distress. But holy
That's
smokes.
that's a combination of the GI distress and just stubbornness on my end.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, fair. I mean, you know what though? I think it's really easy to look at that and be like, "Oh my God, that's so dumb." But then when you're in that, like the number of times that I've had issues and I haven't gone in, and then when I go in, they're like, "Oh my God, like you should have done this long." You're kind of like, "Oh, I guess I didn't really like." You know what I
yeah,
mean? You kind of just want to tough it out. You're like, "Ah, I'm fine," you know.
yeah,
But that's wild. I'm glad I'm glad everything turned out okay though. But so, in terms of your diet now, how has that evolved, I guess? Like, do you have any
yeah.
sort of food sensitivities? Do you work with clients do you talk about gut health a lot with your athletes?
So we don't talk about gut health specifically because it's so like broad, right? Like the foods and the timing of foods and the macronutrients that affect one person is gonna like be completely different from the next person, right? But we do focus on eating like an adult, so making sure there are fruits and vegetables in your diets even during mass phases. I know that, you know, like, oh no, you need to keep foods calorically dense during mass phases, but I think that the inclusion of veggies and fruits, you know, maybe at smaller amounts, obviously, during mass phases, helps overall digestion and will help you eat more in the long run, but because it will keep your stomach happier. So I think things like that we definitely talk about. For myself, I've kind of shifted away from being super, super strict. I know when I kind of started the whole bodybuilding journey, I was very, very strict on timing, on food timing, on like exactly what foods to eat. And now I kind of follow more of like an 80-20 rule. You know, you've heard that, right? Little less stringent with my meal timing, and it's netted me like zero ill effect. Uh, I think worrying about getting, you know, a meal exactly like 15 minutes in after a workout versus like maybe I'll go for a walk instead. It's totally fine. It hasn't affected my performance or my
Yeah.
progress in the least bit. Kind of enjoying myself here and there. Even on a diet, you know, I'll go have dinner with my family. Before I would never do something like that. And yeah, I think the overall stress of not having to worry about that minutia, especially when you're more focused on the long term and the bigger picture, has helped me a lot.
Yeah, I definitely think that it can be really important to go through phases of less restriction, but you're adopting more of like an informed eating approach. I think a lot of that too, the reason why you're able to do that and still be successful is just because you have accrued, you know, what, 20 years or something like that you said of dieting
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
And so, you know, a lot of the times at some point, if I'm working with a nutrition client, at some point I'll usually get them to track their macros for a period.
yeah.
Whether or not that's going to be the strategy long term, like I'd say probably 80% of my clients don't track macros. I
Oh
don't think
wow,
it's
okay.
necessary. Even my physique based athletes, believe it or not. But that's because we do like a very in-depth lifestyle type approach. But at some point, I will be getting pretty much everyone to be tracking macros, just because I do think it's super important. That being said, I also don't coach like contest prep bodybuilders, right?
Yeah,
Like I coach bodybuilders, but in the off season, I have always just said like I don't I don't want to fuck with that stuff. Like until I've done a show myself, I just I just feel like there's so much shit in that last, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks that you can't possibly understand unless you've done it yourself. You
Yeah,
know?
well, I mean, you to have that sort of insight without even having gone through it is huge because you nailed it on the head. It is because when I first got into bodybuilding, I didn't know about. I thought it was like, oh, this is going to be easy, and
Yeah, yeah,
surely it was one of the hardest things I've ever done.
yeah, yeah. And that's the thing, right? Like, there's so much stuff that I'm like, I know that I'm not aware of, and so until I do it, if I ever do decide to do it, then I'm just like not going to coach people to contest prep.
If you want to do a prep, let me know. I'll prep you through what shit.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it would be really cool to go through the process, but I probably wouldn't want to compete like on stage or anything like
Oh,
that.
that's fine. We'll still oil you up for pictures.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, right? Just for like a Tinder profile or something. But yeah, I don't know. I think it'd be really interesting. But in terms of some of the things you've talked a little bit about how your training, your diet, stuff like that has evolved. I've certainly noticed that when you look at optimizing something, I mean, people will talk about how, let's say, nutrient timing is going to make like such a small difference, or supplementation, or maybe ice baths or whatever. But I also think that as you become more advanced and you really pull all the levers and you're kind of firing on all cylinders more or less, I think each little incremental thing that you do can have a very, very profound effect because it's synergistic. And so I think that really is more so speaking to advanced athletes. And I'd be curious to know what things that you're focusing on now in your level of experience that you've noticed are really having a big effect that maybe previously you didn't. I don't know if I would say like
No,
you didn't think of that big, but I'm sure you
no,
kind
no.
of
I know what you're saying. Yeah. So it's actually exactly kind of what you're saying, but the opposite in a way. So let me
it's the exact
clarify.
opposite of what you're saying.
No, 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 no. But it's exactly right up the, kind of your logic. So like you're saying, every single thing, even the little things, help a ton when you're an advanced athlete. I
Sure,
think
yeah.
that's true. 100%. It helps, right? Incrementally, and especially if you kind of like gather them all together and you can use them really to drive your nutrition and training. Yes. That said, I was doing a lot of those things, and if those things cause you stress to do them, I think there's a possibility that the stress caused by those getting those little things checked off can have a net negative impact to actually doing them. And that's something I've learned personally. I'm not saying, so I think that really depends person to person, right? In theory, what you're saying is correct. Every single little thing, the more advanced you get, is going to help your progress. But if those little things, like you said, cause you stress that just give you a net negative impact, then I think it's just better to not worry about it. And that's where kind of I'm in right now, and I'm in a better kind of place performance wise, progress wise, because I just let go. I don't have to have like exactly 32 grams of carbs in my shake or eat 80 grams of carbs 1.5 hours before I work out. Sometimes I'll wake up, I'll grab a protein shake, and I'm like, I don't really feel like eating. I'll go train, and I'll have some of the best training I've had. Versus prior, well, I'll do it, but man, I'm like, oh man, it's not really sitting well with my stomach, or like maybe I didn't really need that, or me just have to rush and worry exactly about having to do that. Maybe that stressed me out a little bit. But yeah,
No, I can completely agree with that. So right now I'm on, I don't want to say a diet break because I'm not on a diet break, but I'm not tracking calories. I kind of have a set parameters around my nutrition. So it's like, okay, I got to eat 5 times a day, no snacking, vegetables and fruits with every meal, X amount of lean protein per meal, X amount of carbs and stuff like that. And you can kind of know like roughly, but I can eat
yeah,
whatever the fuck I want, which is nice. And so, I mean, I still think that what you're talking about kind of is something similar in the sense that you're managing allostatic load. So, like whether it's nutrient timing or it's just reducing stress and that total psychological, emotional burden, whatever, all of that stuff does definitely play in. And I think a lot of those subjective variables too that are kind of harder to manage or maybe harder to measure probably
yeah,
become a little bit more important as you become more experienced because you kind of are a lot more in tune with your body, your emotions, just how other things and various various factors sort of influence your psychology, your emotions, your
Yeah, which is why I kind of went back to the whole thing where what you were saying was correct. I think one of the most important things is stress management, especially the more advanced you are. So by not doing these things, I'm doing that little thing where it's really going to help everything else.
yeah. Have you noticed? So it sounds like that's kind of like I don't want to speak for you, but it sounds like that's kind of like this primary bottleneck where if this gets messed up, then there's all these downstream potential negative effects. And so I've definitely noticed that with I'd say a lot more of my athletes now. Maybe it's just because I'm noticing it more. I'm not sure, but I've definitely noticed that I've been focusing a lot more on sleep with
Yes.
a lot of my guys, and not just the duration, but also when they're going to bed, when they're waking up, the quality, what they're doing before, what they're doing when they get like just certain things like that. And I'm noticing that like when I do that, their adherence to their diet's better, their training performance is better, their stress is better, their mood's better. All these subjective metrics that I track during my like kind of weekly check-ins are all improved pretty dramatically. And you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell just by looking at, I guess, like the raw or aggregate data. Because you might be like, okay, well, he's getting 7 to 8 hours sleep here, and over here he's getting 7 to 8 hours sleep, but now his performance and everything is way better. Like how, you know? And so I don't know. I think it's interesting to find what those, I guess, primary factors are that if I can just make one change, it's almost like,
Yeah.
sorry, I know I'm being a little bit long-winded. It's like if
No.
you see someone messing up a bunch of stuff on their squat, you can give them 10 cues or you can give them one cue to correct the nine others. You
Yeah,
know? That's kind of the way that I see it, I guess.
for sure. And I think you kind of nailed it on the head on that. But it's also, I think, hard to pick out what that one thing is, right? Because at that point now you're kind of be like, you're kind of there like, like therapists, tell me everything that's wrong and let me try to find the root cause of it, right? Sometimes you're successful with that, right? By having a conversation with your clients, um, you know, but I find that beyond, asking them, maybe try to get to sleep an hour earlier, practice some, good bedtime hygiene, um, really focus on sleep. If there's any stressors in your life, try to relax an hour or two before bed, before you wind down for the night. Those things really tend to help. But beyond that, a lot of it is kind of like, I feel like, unfortunately, it's out of our control, but it's also sometimes out of their control too, because work, family, relationships, it all demands from us, right? And
Hmm.
to kind of tell them to not do those things, I think it's hard sometimes, right? It's tough. It puts us in a tough position. But once in a while, it is a simple kind of like you tell them one thing to do, where it's like, hey, just don't go to sleep at 11, p.m. and maybe get to sleep at 10, and that's a instant fix because they're like, oh crap, that I don't mind that, and I don't mind doing it, and it works. But yeah, a lot of times it's easier said than done, and it's usually not that simple.
Oh, 100%. Like a lot of the times when I'm working with someone, it's very iterative. Like I might need to push their sleep back a little bit, but that might take several weeks, if not months. Like I know there was
Yeah,
one client who he was a PhD in sports science. He was doing his PhD defense, and I think that whole like that last 6 months or the first 6 months we were working together was just like he'd get to sleep between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. Like it was just all over the place.
that's
Some days
crazy.
he'd sleep for 10 hours, some days he'd sleep for 2 hours. And so it was so nuts. And so it took about 6 months, maybe a little bit more even, just to get him on a decent schedule where he was going to bed before midnight every day. And
Yeah,
like
sometimes
it's
you're
so
successful with that, but it's awesome when it happens. And sometimes it's just like I said, out of your like example, real quick. I have one of my clients. He is part of a SWAT, and once in a while, like he'll have a sting operation, and he's just like, it's just gonna be messed up this week. I'm like, I know,
yeah.
and like he'll record back like that week. He's gotten like 4 hours of sleep. He went to sleep. He didn't sleep all night for this one because he was up all night during an operation or something like that, where it's just out of control completely.
Oh, 100%. I guess I was more so saying like you just kind of do the best with what you can, right? Like it
Yeah,
I was more so agreeing with you in the sense that it's like it does I don't think anything's really a simple fix, especially because
no,
behavior is pretty ingrained.
yeah,
Like it takes so long to just change fairly simplistic behaviors. You know, like you look at something in isolation. It's like, can you go to bed earlier? Yeah, sure. Okay, now do it every day. It's like, oh, you know, and then it's a whole different story.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've always actually really enjoyed about the content that you share is it's really positive, like almost annoyingly positive, because it just makes me feel like a
Oh,
piece of shit. You know, I'm like, fuck, maybe I'm an asshole. I gotta try being nicer. You know, and so yeah, I've always found that you're like really, really positive presence, and even when people are pretty negative. And so I don't have a big following. I got like 4,000, 5,000 followers, something like that. You've got many multiples times that. And I've definitely noticed that less so now, but before, you know, I think it can be kind of difficult when you start getting heat from people or like getting hate or people just kind of try and talk shit and just be negative for no reason. But
yeah.
I've always really kind of respected the fact that you stay really positive kind of all the time. At least that's kind of been my experience to the content and stuff like that you put out. And I think that that's really something that's very difficult, but also it's something that's really needed in the industry as well. So one of the things that I'd be curious to learn about is how you approach people who are just kind of negative, who are trying to sort of drag you down, who are trying to talk shit and whatever, because I think regardless of what most people say, it probably does affect them to some degree. Like I know some things certainly, you know, get under my skin. So how do you
Yeah.
make sure that you can kind of keep some distance with that, not let it kind of poison the message and what you're trying to do in general?
Yeah. So like being completely transparent, me trying to be more positive is definitely something I've worked on over the years. I wasn't like that in the past. I was very like, if someone came at me, I'd come right back at them, right? Where, it's what I want to do sometimes. And now over the years, I've learned where, every time that happens and you know there's that kind of like back and forth and it gets nowhere, I don't feel really good about myself at the end of the day. And I've accomplished nothing. um, and there's always going to be those type of people out there. So I kind of just like little by little, it wasn't an instant switch. But tried not to pay too much attention to it and not let it affect me and not engage with that type of behavior. And I've noticed that I feel much better. I feel better, which, that's really important to me, right? Especially when you're, trying to keep stress as low as possible versus engaging with these people because they're always going to be there. And the way I think about it is, these people that want to just kind of spew negativity online, um, usually the case is that they're kind of angry at themselves also. Because if you think about, kind of put yourself in that position, Daniel, right? Imagine what type of person that you would have to be, like what situation, what living conditions that you have to be in to be online and go to multiple accounts and just spew hate. Not that great a picture you could kind of picture, right? It's like you'd have to be in a pretty rough spot. So then when I kind of think of that kind of stuff, I feel bad for that person too. So it
Hmm.
makes me want to kind of engage less and sometimes even be like, hey man, it's okay. Like, thanks, man. Or just kind of be a little positive because they must be, not all of them, some of them just being dicks to be dicks, but some of them might, be in like kind of bad life spot to make them even want to, you know, be that way. So yeah, that's the way I think about it, and maybe try to use some empathy and kind of move on from there. And usually on the nets, it makes me feel a little better, kind of just day to day.
No, that's fair. I can definitely see that. I'm someone who kind of gets very like caught up in things. So I can be
Oh
like
yeah,
totally fine. And then if someone bring like I'm very passionate sometimes when I talk. So let's say I'm chatting with a friend or something and they bring something up that made me mad in the past. I go from being like not mad, but then the more that I talk about it, I just get really worked up and like I start talking louder, being more expressive, and you're just like, oh, and they're like, yo, chill. And I'm like, oh yeah, I don't know why I'm getting all bent out of shape. Like this happened like 5 years ago, you know? But it's like when you engage exactly like what you're saying, it's like it just pulls you right back into that shit. So back in like 2016, I used to have Facebook. I think I still have Facebook, but I'm on there maybe once every couple months or something.
yeah,
And I think that was the worst place for just negativity. Like, because
Oh
I
yeah.
had actually a fairly big page back then. So I'd get like all of my posts, I'd get like hundreds of comments on. And I'm a very outspoken person. So I'm not really someone to like kind of, I mean, I try and make a good argument about things, but there are certain things where it's like, no, I feel this way. And whether that's counterculture or not, I don't really give a shit. And so I'd get all sorts of hate for certain things. And like, then I started getting sucked into these conversations and I just noticed that I got so negative, like so negative, not just even when I was online, but just my outlook on life and people
Yeah.
in general got so bad. And I was like becoming just as toxic. And when I knew that I was like, okay, I gotta get off this was when I saw someone's post and then I started writing a comment and it was like 3 paragraphs long and I'm like, what the fuck am I doing? Like,
Yep.
I'm done. I like deleted my Facebook, and I was like, I'm done. I can't do this. And so so I was just like, yeah, it's crazy how you can get sucked in, and if you're not really careful, it's really easy to just like slide into that negativity and just be sucked into all the nonsense that's online. And then you shut your phone off for a second, you go outside and just have a conversation with a random person. You're like, oh, most people are actually pretty good. They're
Yeah.
pretty normal. Like we're all right. you
Yeah.
know. But yeah, it's weird when you kind of get sucked in. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about as well was your line of shirts and clothing, and you got a couple
Oh.
different things that you were going on. We chatted about it last time a little bit. You've got a leather jacket company where you guys do leather coats for kind of more jacked dudes. Is that
No,
right?
like kind of everyone. Yeah, yeah, we do. That's my
Yeah.
like old. Yeah, I'm surprised. So every time someone brings that up, I'm like, oh yeah, I do that. I forgot. That's a kind of a weird part of my life, but I still love it. It's yeah, I do custom leather jackets. Mostly not for jack guys. Mostly for like the regular old like guy that's interested in fashion. But once in a while, I get that crossover of like bodybuilder and fashionista, and they'll want a jacket, and I'll size them up for one, and yeah, make sure it fits them. And then the other thing is that yeah, I just make some shirts. I like the designs. They're mostly for me in the beginning, but some of my followers and friends are like, "Oh, I'd wear that," so I kind of threw it up there. It's nothing big. It's just something I like to do, and if people enjoy the designs, that's awesome.
That's wicked, man.
Yeah.
All right, so we're kind of coming up on the hour mark. Is there
Yeah.
anything that maybe we didn't touch on, or that you think is pertinent to share, or just something you've been kind of a little bit more interested in maybe recently?
Um, no, not really. I think we touched on everything. Yeah.
Sweet, awesome, man. So where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram, at Charlton_Banks.
Awesome. Are you anywhere else? Do you have a YouTube or website or anything like
Uh,
that?
I have a TikTok. It's the same handle. And I have a website for my coaching. It's Ascend with like this, no E, because I don't know how to spell, but ascendcoaching.com.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Definitely make sure you go give him a follow, check out what he's doing, check out his shirts, check out his leather jackets, check out his coaching. Charlie, thanks so much for jumping on, man. I really appreciate it.
Of course, man. Anytime.